Hello everyone, I am the Magic Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from March of the Machine Aftermath, Jolrael, voice of Zhalfir. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support your channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Jolrael is a 3/3 human druid for 2 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue. She has 2 triggered abilities. The first one animates a land at the beginning of combat on your turn. Until end of turn, that land becomes an XX green and blue bird land with flying and haste, where X is the number of cards in your hand. While that enough has the potential of making a huge beater to take huge chunks of life out of an opponent, her second triggered ability draws you cards for each land creature dealing combat damage to a player. This is worded in the best way, which is triggered per creature and not opponent. So if you hit any number of opponents with 10 land creatures amongst them, then you draw 10 cards, for example. Suffice it to say that this deck is going to care about land creatures. A lot. So much so that the deck is running plenty of effects that also animate lands. Cards like Kamal's Will, Natural Affinity, and Sylvan Awakening allow for explosive plays since they're a one-time only way of animating all your lands. The first two do so at instant speed, so this can help create blockers in a pinch. Kamal's Will is especially powerful because it also makes your lands indestructible, so that helps protect them from board wipes turn mass land destruction. Speaking of, casting Natural Affinity in response to a board wipe is never not funny. Watch your opponents scramble to either counter Natural Affinity or the board wipe, lest it become less a Wrath of God and more an Armageddon. Sylvan Awakening also gives your lands indestructible, but it's a sorcery, so you can't cast it in response to a board wipe. However, this effect lasts until your next turn, so if you're anticipating a board wipe, this is a good way to deter it, or to simply swing in with a ton of man lands and leave the math to the blockers. Leech of the Tangle is another way to animate your lands, but it's also dependent on timing. While the previous ones are spells, this card's effect depends on connecting with combat damage. It shouldn't be too difficult though, since it's an 8/8 with trample. It does cost a whopping 8 mana to cast, but that's nothing to a green deck. You do have to connect each time you get more lands though, since it only animates those lands you give an awakening counter to, which is also useful in and of itself since you can choose which lands to animate, and those lands are creatures while they have that awakening counter on them. 8/8 creatures to boot. Nature's Revolt and Life and Limb animates our lands without much fuss. As long as they exist on the battlefield, the lands are animated. What's best about the first one is that it animates all lands, so this would also deter anyone from playing board wipes since they'd also hit all lands. Unless you have that player in your pod who just wants to watch the world burn. Life and Limb only animates Forest though, which is why Yavimaya Cradle of Growth is included. While this might seem like a roundabout way of going about it, the deck is already going to have forests anyways, and it's not like Yavimaya is going to take up a land slot. It helps with color fixing too, which is going to be important here, especially with Felonite Druid also in the deck. You need to sacrifice a creature in order to activate it, but it does animate all of your forests until end of turn. It's very useful, and that sacrifice clause isn't a hindrance in this deck. In fact, it might even be a good thing, as we'll see later on. Beastmaster Ascension is a card that loves all of our lands being animated at once. Regardless if our lands are 1/1s, 2/2s, 2/3s, etc., they will all essentially get +5/+5 if we attack with at least 7 of them. Granted, you can also build up to this, but nothing's more satisfying than dropping this enchantment before swinging out with all creatures, leaving the math of the blockers. We can also animate our lands one at a time with Nissa Vital Force, Nissa Who Shakes the World, Nissa Worldwaker, and Renin Worldwaker. This might seem a bit slow compared to the previously mentioned effects, but these planeswalkers all have other useful abilities as well. At least the animation effect of the middle 2 cards don't go away at the end of the turn, so make sure you keep that in mind. The first Nissa is absolutely busted if you ultimate her, which is quite easy since she just has to last an entire turn after using her +1 ability. It's an emblem with landfall that draws you a card. Absolutely insane in this deck. Her -3 ability is also useful if you needed it. However, playing her, animating a land, and then getting the emblem is the usual route for her use. The second Nissa has a non-loyalty ability that's busted in this deck, having our forest give an additional green mana when tapped for mana. This paired with Yavimaya is glorious. Her emblem is also busted in the deck since it gives our lands indestructible. Not only that, but we can fetch for all of the forests in our library and put them onto the battlefield tapped. It does take a while to get there though, but getting that emblem in a man lands deck is crucial. The third Nissa can help accelerate our mana production by untapping up to 4 forests with her second ability. Her ultimate is similar to the previous Nissa in that she fetches for all of the basics in our library onto the battlefield tapped and then animates them. This effect does not go away at the end of the turn, so make sure you keep track of which is which. Ren helps us color fix with her static ability, which is a nice bonus but not really that necessary in a 2-colored deck. Her -2 ability helps her cover permanents, but we still need to mill 3 cards to do so, which might be a bit of a gamble to get that card back that we want. Her emblem makes up for it though, providing a Muldrotha type effect that isn't limited to how many times it's done per permanent type. This is absolutely crazy at creating a revolving door between our graveyard and battlefield, which we'll soon see better in the greater detail later on. Ashaya Soul of the Wild does something unique in that she turns non-token creatures into forests. So instead of animating lands, she's land-defying creatures. This makes them land creatures and thus will trigger Jolrael on connecting with combat damage. This also helps accelerate our mana production as well, since those non-token creatures are also now mana dorks. This has so many applications in this deck. Your imagination is the limit. This is amazing hate tech against Cyclonic Rift since it hits non-lands. But there's an amazing engine with her and some other cards in the deck that I will explain in greater detail later on. Going back to animating lands, Blinkmoth Nessus, Crawling Barrens, Fairy Conclave, Inkmoth Nessus, Lair of the Hydra, Lumbering Falls, Mishra's Factory, Mobilized District, Mutavault, and Treetop Village are lands that can animate themselves. These man lands aren't the only ones you can run, but they're here for being some of the cheapest to activate to become creatures. Granted, the goal is to animate our lands as cheaply as possible, but these don't take up slots in the deck, so you might as well. Just be careful not to add too many lands that enter the battlefield tapped. The last man land of the deck is Dryad Arbor. This is already a land creature, but since it's also a forest, it can be fetched for with all of the effects that can get forests out of our library. Awaken the Woods is also an amazing spell for this deck, since it essentially creates X copies of Dryad Arbor. With the amount of ways this deck creates a huge amount of mana, this can easily create an army of mana lands to overwhelm the board, and or accelerate your mana twofold. As for the best lands to animate, Cascading Cataracts, Darksteel Citadel, and Tanglepool Bridge get the job done since they have built-in indestructibility. Regardless of how you're animating these lands, they're great at either blocking or going aggro to force blocks. While indestructibility protects them against board wipes, we do have to protect our other lands as well. Fierce Guardianship, An Offer You Can't Refuse, Swan Song, Negate, and Counterspell is a pretty decent counter magic suite against board wipes. Granted, the worst board wipes are those cast when you're the only one with animated lands. That has the potential of blowing us out of the game, so it's worth it to run a handful of them just in case. Same with Heroic Intervention and Rapid Vigor. These are actually hilarious to cast in response to someone's board wipe turned Armageddon, because then you're the only one with creatures and lands. They're also just amazing in general since the decks need interaction anyways. Speaking of interaction, Coastal Breach, Consuming Tide, Crush of Tentacles, Devastation Tide, and Flood of Tears are absolutely oppressive in this deck. Not only will they bounce everything that isn't a land, but if our lands were animated with effects that don't go away when the source does, we'd be the only one with creatures. Or if we had Ashaya in play, then we keep our non-token creatures too, since they're also lands. Casting these spells at the right time can almost guarantee us the match. Granted, we can't always also just overload Cyclonic Rift and be done with it. However, keep in mind that also doesn't hit lands, so if you animated all the lands on the table, opponents will still have blockers. It's still an oppressive spell to overload anyways and still worth a slot. As for lands, Beast Within can get rid of any land we want gone, or any permanent for that matter. In any case, if we're animating lands, we can get rid of any problematic land, same as we could a creature, but this is still a great card in the 99 as a catch-all solution. Using that previous section of effects to animate lands isn't the only redundancy the deck has for our commander. While Jolrael can animate a land into epic proportions, she also has us draw cards whenever a land creature deals combat damage to an opponent. But being in green-blue means that we can also just run Bident of Thassa, Coastal Piracy, Reconnaissance Mission, Oran Frostfang, and Toski Bear of Secrets in the 99. Best of all, these cards don't care if the creature is a land, a token, etc. Any creature dealing combat damage to a player will draw us a card. As a bonus, the Snake gives our attacking creatures Death Touch. Suffice it to say that these permanents draw us into a ton of cards when left unchecked. So much so that Reliquary Tower, Thought Vessel, and Decanter of Endless Water are included just in case. Either way, these 3 cards are already worth including here due to the commander. Just be careful that the tower doesn't get blown when it is animated. The other 2 being Mana Rocks also help with mana acceleration, with Soul Ring being the only other Mana Rock in the deck. The deck is green, so we don't need to run Mana Rocks in it, but these helping us keep a fat hand are worth it. EC Tyrant of the Gyre Strait, Azusa Lost Was Seeking, Druid Class, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Exploration, and Wayward Swordtooth help us drop those lands stuck in our hand when we're drawing into a ton of cards. Nothing like dropping a free creature to overwhelm the board. Creatures that can tap for mana, no less. However, having multiple of these out accelerate our game in more ways than one, but we'll see that later. Let's just say that we're not only playing lands from our hand. Renin 7, the final planeswalker of the deck, has an absolutely busted ability here. Her Zeo Loyalty ability simply has us drop all lands from our hand onto the battlefield tapped. Her other abilities are okay, with her ultimate being amazing at getting another way to get an unlimited hand size. But she's here mostly for that second ability. Not only for when we're drawing tons of cards, but when combined with Trade Routes. Trade Routes is another one of those cards in the deck whose utility is limited only by your imagination. We can pay 1 and bounce a land we control. This can help in bouncing a land in response to spot removal, or tap out to bounce all of our lands against a board wipe. We can then either play as many as we can with the previous effects, or drop them all at once thanks to Renin 7. We can also pay 1 and discard lands from our hand in a pinch to draw a card. However, we can combine both this and Renin 7 to get insane levels of landfall triggers with the deck, which we'll soon see. Cultivator Colossus is another amazing card that interacts with Trade Routes. In response to its enter the battlefield trigger, we can use Trade Routes to bounce all of our lands, and then when the trigger resolves, we can drop all of our lands and draw that many cards. However, if we drew into more lands, we can keep dropping those new lands as well to keep drawing into more cards. This interaction is madness, and I'm here for it. Farseek Nature's Lore, 3 visits into the north, and Rampant Growth are some more ways of dropping lands, this time straight from the library. Yes, they're 2 mana spells that accelerate our mana production, but keep in mind that this deck cares about lands, so they're amazing early game as well as any point in the game, especially with the landfall effects of the deck. Rampaging Balos and Scoot Swarm help us get even more creatures via landfall effects. They each create a creature token whenever a land enters the battlefield. If we have static land animation effects, we're essentially getting twice as many creatures per trigger. Combine this with the previously mentioned Trade Routes interactions, and you can see how easily this will get out of hand. Same with Tireless Provisioner. The amount of treasure tokens we create is mind-blowing. This can then fuel further insane plays with the amount of mana we can generate. Or, if we're low in life for being the arch enemy, create food tokens to help us gain life. Tatiova Bentic Druid has another epic landfall payoff in the form of drawing cards and gaining life. The amount of cards we have the potential of drawing is such that we have to be careful not to deck ourselves. So if you want to also include Thassa's Oracle type win cons in the deck, you definitely could. However, I chose a more aggressive route to victory than oops I win effects. Earlier I showed ways to mitigate our board getting destroyed due to our lands becoming creatures and thus vulnerable to creature hate. However, that might not always be a bad thing. Ancient Green Warden, Conduit of Worlds, and Crucible of Worlds are included to be able to play lands from our graveyard. And these aren't the only cards that do that either. You could also run Perennial Behemoth and Ramen-Up Excavator if you wanted all 5 of them. However, when testing, I found that these 3 are more than enough, especially since we're drawing so many cards. Besides, Ancient Green Warden is even further busted since it doubles landfall triggers. Speaking of, using these to constantly replay any of the deck's 7 fetch lands, and you can very easily get all basic land typed cards from your library onto the battlefield, especially if you can play more than 1 land per turn. Combining this engine with other landfall effects, and you can already see how this can get out of hand. Elvish Reclaimer is another way we can make the most of this, but since it requires tapping to activate, we can only do so once per turn. However, we can sacrifice any nondescript land to fetch out a utility land like Yamavaya, Reliquary Tower, an indestructible land, a man land, etc., and then we could just replay that sacrificed land from our graveyard with those effects. Splendid Reclamation is a one-time only effect since it's on a sorcery, but resolving this with a graveyard full of lands is absolutely bonkers when we're making the most of landfall effects. However, one of my favorite cards in the deck for these types of engines is Eudora Grave Gardener. Once your lands are animated, Eudora opens a revolving door between your battlefield and graveyard. Any non-token land creature dying will return face down as a forest. However, that forest will also be a creature. So when it dies, it'll return face down as a forest creature. Combine this with the land sacrifice outlet and you have an infinite combo. You can deck the table with something like Altar of Dementia. However, I chose something simpler like Zuran Orb. Altar of Dementia doesn't really work well on its own, so I'm not running it here, since it also depends on Eudora. However, Zuran Orb is amazing here. It's free to cast and free to activate, and it works regardless of what engines we have in play. However, once we have an engine online, we can gain as close to infinite life as we want. If you want a flavorful non-infinite number when going through this loop, choose 3-3. Constant Miss is another amazing way to make the most of your lands, especially if you can replay them from the graveyard. Thanks to this spell and the engine, you'll never lose to combat damage to, especially commander damage. 3-3 life might save you from non-infinite combat damage, but not if you get hit by 21 points of commander damage. We can even protect ourselves this way thanks to Sylvan Safekeeper. You can protect any creature by just sacrificing a land, which isn't that much of an issue here, at instant speed and without investing in mana. This card is amazing. Granted, Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots are also included to help protect our key creatures, but don't sleep on Sylvan Safekeeper. On its own, it's great, and it's even better with an engine going. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running Breeding Pool, Rimewood Falls, and Tangled Islet, as well as 4 of each snow-covered basic land to make the most of the deck's ramp effects along with Into the North. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Jolrael, Voice of Zhalfir. While Jolrael might seem like another green-blue lands matter commander, what I love about her is that she isn't entirely necessary for the deck to run. Sure, it's amazing to have a card advantage engine right in the command zone, but if she's otherwise dealt with, the deck can still make do. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Medic Kirby, and happy brewing.